Hey there riders, Moto Journo Kris here today, and Yamaha's R15 version 3 has just arrived in Australia, and I wanted to give you my ride impressions of this particular machine because it's just impressed me so much. And I guess the reason it's impressed me so much is because when we think about a lot of these smaller capacity machines, we really do often kind of put them into a different category to the 300 to 400cc options. And the limitations of the smaller capacity and smaller power bikes can really come through. And that's not necessarily a problem. However, in riding this bike, in riding the R15 version 3, I've very much been surprised that I don't think many of those limitations really apply to this bike, at least not to the extent that I would expect for a 155cc. And Yamaha have done an exceptional job delivering this bike here in Australia for under $5,000. So for under $5,000, what are you getting? Single disc brake on the front. There's a Bybre caliper, so second-rate Brembo caliper, 282mm rotor. You're getting 41mm non-adjustable forks, which is a nice hefty fork for such a small capacity machine. 11-litre fuel tank, 815mm seat height. They've brought the pillion seat height down on these particular bikes. While you can quite easily take a pillion on one of these, probably not the big consideration for a lot of people. Styling, massively updated. They've given it that really clean front end that you see on the R3 and the R6. Hasn't got the really thin headlights that you'll see on the top end models, but it's a really nice looking machine now. And I think one of the things they've done on this bike is they've made it look like the larger capacity machine. It looks like an R3, and I think if you took off those R15 stickers, it'd be quite easy for a lot of people not realize that you're on a little 155cc machine. Obviously, you've got a decent fairing, a bit of wind protection, very simple controls. There's no electronics on this particular bike. There's not even ABS, in fact. There's an LCD display. It's got a gear shift indicator and a gear indicator, which are nice touches, quite premium touches for such a competitively priced small capacity machine. Again, coming back to the styling, there's lots of little details which look beautiful on this bike. Like you got the cutouts in the tank, really, really nice. On the tail, you've also got basically those really aerodynamic tail panels, which you can actually see through, straight through to the back of the bike as well, much like the R1. So a nice little bit of, family resemblance there. I think they've really stepped up on the styling and the overall bike feel side of things. You do have kind of some clip-on style bars. They're, off the top of the forks. They're not as low as a really aggressive clip-on, but you still get that sports bike feel with quite an upright seating position on this bike. There are no adjustable levers whatsoever. Pretty good front brake, reasonable view through the mirrors. They're not quite wide enough for me to see around my elbows, but on this style of bike, that's not unusual. That seat height, as I mentioned, it's not as low as some of the entry-level options, even some of the larger capacity entry-level options. So that is something worth considering. However, this bike weighs in at 142 kilos and it's super light. If you're concerned about rolling the bike around or being overwhelmed by a bike's weight and you think like an R3 is going to be too heavy for you, check one of these out because they are so incredibly light. Rolling it around the garage particularly, you really notice it. So if you're a bit overwhelmed at the thought of handling quite a heavy machine, this might be a much better option as long as you can cope with that slightly higher seat height. Of course, the big changes are to that engine. It's been bored out 1mm. It's a 155cc now, about 2.5 extra horsepower, which is a pretty significant increase in horsepower when you consider, I think the old one was about 17 horsepower and this one's about 19.5. It's a nice jump up. Torque hasn't really changed, but what I have noticed is with that variable valve actuation, it's got a nice low end, pretty decent mid-range, and then a really good top end as well, which is why I was saying this is quite comparable, I reckon, to some of those 250cc 4s. My FZX250 could only do 140 kilometers an hour, and that was on a good day with a big enough straight and maybe a little bit of a downhill. This bike, I reckon, as far as performance, is very much on par with that. You'll get up to 140 kilometers an hour relatively easily. It's got that beautiful top end. Off the mark, it's got a little bit of a punch as you release that clutch and the bike starts moving. Then it's a little bit flat in first gear, so you really do need to rev it, probably out to the red line before nicking it up into second. But once you've done that, the power is good. So probably the big area that I noticed, kind of that 155cc power, was in first gear taking off. It's a little bit on the slow side for taking off when you compare it to, a 300 or a 400cc bike, but that's to be expected. And then when it comes to actually using the bike normally, once you're up into that mid-range at about 7,000 RPM is where I reckon it gets pretty decent, pretty good. It's very much a bike which kind of has that power band thing going for it. You know, people talk about it back in the old, like particularly two-stroke days. It's not to that extent. You've still got reasonable performance everywhere, but you will want to keep this bike on the boil. And that's one of the big differences between, say, an R3 or a Ninja 400. You'll need to be a little bit more active on this bike to keep the performance right up in those areas where you get the best performance out of it. Now, if you're thinking to yourself, oh, I want a slightly larger capacity bike which I can be quite lazy on and have a bit more torque down low, that's fair enough. Maybe the larger capacity machines are for you. But if you're happy being active on the bike and really revving it out, then this could well do the job for you. And as I said, doing 140 kilometers an hour is plenty of performance for a new rider. You know, it'll be fine on the freeway. There's very little vibes on the freeway as you get right up into that 130, 140 kilometer an hour kind of area, which is really impressive for a little single. It seems to handle those higher speeds without any issues at all. I did some kind of extended highway sections with the bike at those kind of speeds, no issue at all. And that's normally my big concern. You know, if you're looking at one of these smaller capacity machines, for me here in Australia at least, because a lot of us have to do the higher speed roads of 100, 110, you want enough performance to do that comfortably with a little bit spare so that you can do overtaking maneuvers. And I was actually really impressed by the R15 because it can do that exceptionally well. Now, talking about the suspension, as I mentioned, 41mm forks, you've got a monoshock on the rear. Now, what I really noticed was, I think the weight of the bike is what makes this such a great package, because it's quite a bit lighter than the R3 and the Ninja 400 and stuff like that, which does give it a huge advantage. I found the suspension really well sorted. I've got to say, I'm only 70 kilos, I'm 180 centimeters, but I found this suspension system so well controlled. It was a really fun and easy thing to ride. In the real world conditions that you'll expect to see on a commuter-based supersport bike like this, where potholes and poorer road surfaces are the norm, and a sportier suspension setup can make for a harsh ride at times, this instead offers a supple, well-damped and controlled overall ride that isn't as sporty as you'll find on the R3 or MT-03, but is more aimed at good comfort. Not overly powerful brakes and the light weight also massively help to ensure suspension is above expectations, at least for me. There's no upside down forks, but that's clearly to keep costs down, and I don't feel they're particularly necessary on a bike like this unless you bought it for the track, which probably isn't most riders. On the same note, those front brakes work really well, again, because even though it's not a super impressive brake package on the front, the bike is so light it's very easy to bring the bike up to a halt. If you're a significantly heavier rider than me, you'll probably find that the weight benefit, the lightweight benefit of this machine and the lower amount of power is going to start to count against you more. But if you're a smaller rider, I think it's really going to tick the boxes and you might be quite surprised at how good this machine is. Same on the rear, nice powerful rear brake, it really does the job. On some bikes the rear brake doesn't do all that much, but on this there's good power from it. On the handling side of things, this thing is a super sharp handler. They've actually basically revised that delta box frame, the wheelbase is shorter, I think they brought the trail down as well, and it's a super sharp handler. Jumping on this bike from something else, it took me a little bit of time just to get used to that sharp handling because it'll turn on a dime. It's quite aggressive. They put some larger and wider tyres on this bike, I think probably to slow things down a little bit, and overall it's just a beautiful thing to ride. And I've got to say, I'm actually surprised it's very nice and stable through the corners as well. I thought that perhaps that really sharp handling might make it a little bit skittish through the corners, but surprisingly not at all. It's quite a stable machine as you start to get it leant over and as you go through the corners with a bit of speed and, you know, lean over a little bit more. So really quite impressive. Check out my ergonomics video for the full look at the ergonomics of this bike. I'm 180 centimeters, 70 kilos. As you can see here, very easy seating position on the bike, good amount of room under that tank. It gets very narrow between the legs as well. It feels a lot like an R3 at the end of the day to me. It's very narrow between the legs, as I said, which means that getting a foot down is nice and easy. I find it very easy to get both feet down flat, which is a great thing for new riders. However, as I mentioned, the seat height's a little bit taller, so you will need to keep an eye on that just to see whether it suits you alongside that really lightweight bike. Obviously, kind of an aggressive seating position. It's still nice upright kind of view down the road, but it's a little bit sportier than the more traditional naked bike style machines, which the bars are a bit taller and that keeps you a bit more upright. But of course, this is very much a proper super sport style machine, even if it's a very small capacity one. And obviously on this bike, you are getting that proper kind of feel. It's not just a bike which they've thrown some fairings on. It's really got that YZF feel to it, and I really like that. And I've got to say, the comfort on this machine was exceptional. Particularly on the Ninja 400, I always find the seat really rough because it's just so hard. On this, it's got a nice comfortable seat. I think the fact I can grab the tank so easily between my legs and, you know, kind of lock into the bike and support a bit of my weight between the pegs and the tank like that is a huge benefit. So it might be that I'm just really lucky that I suit this bike perfectly. But at the end of the day, I'm really impressed with the ergonomics, and I don't think they're too aggressive for a new rider as well. Obviously at full steering lock, you haven't got a heap of room between the tank, but it's not quite at that kind of really extreme super sport 600 kind of level, or even when you like look at the R1 where there's not much room there at all. So at the end of the day, should you consider the R15 version 3? I definitely think you should. Now there's a couple of things to think about. I think if you're a smaller rider, it's definitely going to be a bike which is going to work better for you, because if you're 70 kilos like me, the performance level on this machine is going to be significantly better for you than if you're say 100, 110, 120 kilos and you're a much larger rider. So obviously it's going to be a bike which benefits the smaller rider, the lighter rider. The seat height isn't as low as some of the other more powerful LAMS options, so you will need to keep that in mind. I would say the performance on offer here for a 155 is exceptional. The variable valve actuation makes this bike way better than really it has any right to be. The one thing that you'll need to keep in mind is that you're going to be revving this bike really hard. You're probably going to be revving it to redline. You're probably going to be bouncing off the rev limiter at times when you want to take off fast, and that may not be for you. But I think if you're really interested in making the most of the performance on offer, even more than you'd ever be able to do on an R3, this could well be the option for you. And at under $5,000, I think these are 4.8 right away. It's exceptional value for a brand new bike. Beautiful styling, good level of specification. It's probably going to be a significantly better machine than a lot of the old 250, even some of the really old 300s, you know, those first generation 300s. The lack of ABS is definitely a downside, as is the fact that you need to rev this bike really hard to get the maximum performance out of it, but you've got to decide whether that's right for you. Now, as impressed as I was with the R15, it's important to keep in mind that's in the context of a sub 200cc machine. And while I think this bike would give the GSX250R and CBR300R a run for their money in some ways, trading off some low to mid-range torque for a strong top end, it's obviously not as powerful or torquey as an R3 or Ninja 400, and there is a significant step up in performance there to those machines. As a new rider, you won't miss what you don't know though, and I think the R15 will be plenty capable for the less performance orientated rider. As far as any other disadvantages, there's a couple of areas which look a little bit on the cheap side, but I think are well within reason because of the overall price of this machine. At under $5,000, you know, you're not paying much for the bike and you're getting a lot of bike and realistically a lot of performance as well for your money. The red paint has got like a nice finish and a nice quality to it and a little bit of depth to that paint, a little bit of sparkle to it. The grey, you know, there's no clear coat over that. I do imagine that those grey panels are probably going to be a little bit easier to damage, but at the same time they're probably going to be a much cheaper part to replace in the long term. So as you can see, I'm pretty excited about the R15 version 3, and I think that is because in the past, I've looked at some of the smaller capacity machines and I've kind of gone, I just don't feel like they've got quite enough performance to do the everyday duties. Whereas on the R15, it definitely does. Obviously, you're going to be revving it out pretty hard. It basically uses almost no fuel at all. I've just been amazed at how little fuel it uses. Here in New South Wales, the rego costs of a bike like this are going to be significantly lower because you're instead of being in that mid-range 300 to 400 or even 250cc rego cost, you're actually down a bracket, which keeps things even cheaper. I don't know about the insurance costs, but I imagine that they'd probably be a bit cheaper as well, because, you know, the 125 to 155cc category, it's, you know, almost kind of that pizza delivery category. And while I think it'd be a shame to put a big ugly box on the back of this to do pizza delivery, you certainly could, and it's going to be much funner to ride than all those little scooters and the little CB125s that so many people run around on, because there's just so much more performance here. And it's a really beautiful, cool looking little bike. Anyway, that's my thoughts on Yamaha's R15 version 3 for under $5,000 on the road here in Australia. I reckon it's awesome value. I definitely recommend checking it out if you're a little bit cash strapped but you still want a new bike. I think this may well be the machine for many people who don't want to go to the second-hand market. And like I said, the performance on offer here is, you know, pretty exceptional. You're going to have to rev it out, but that makes it a little bit forgiving. The lack of ABS is a bit of a shame, but I think we can get past that because it's a very manageable machine at the end of the day, as much as I'd like to see that for new riders. And I just think it's a really good option. So if you've enjoyed the video, don't forget to sub, hit that notification bell. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. If you've got any questions at all, I will do my best to answer them as always. Stay safe out there, and thanks for watching.